Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to look at tanking in Legion. Now, there's a few things to discuss here. One, this is going to be a pretty negative video. If that's going to trigger you or set you off, be warned. Other than that, I'm a little bit ill, so if there's any weird cuts in the audio, you'll understand why. I'm just cutting out some coughing. And we're going to look at two things. A lot of the feedback on Legion so far has been very class-focused. That'd be one thing. But it's also important to remember that Blizzard has changed tanking overall. I personally don't believe tanking's in a particularly good place. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the big change overall, so you guys are aware of that. Then we're going to look at a class breakdown in kind of top 5 style, so you can see where I think they are in terms of gameplay. I'm not going to be doing things like how good they are defensively yet in terms of actual numbers, because that's the biggest thing that's definitely going to change over the course of the alpha. Now, what we are going to do is look at this again later on and see whether Blizzard's made enough changes to make these things much better. Some of them are really, really bad. Let's go. So back in January, Celestalon released a blog post that went largely ignored for the moment, aiming to change tanking once again. So we'd been through the Vengeance period and been through the Resolve period, and now we were going to enter a new period. They had various goals to hit to make tanks less self-sustained was the idea. You should require a healer, which is kind of good in theory. How were they going to do that? Basically, they were going to hit certain goals. They were saying active mitigation should be more rewarding. Major cooldowns like shield wall should feel more valuable. And tanks need to be weaker so that mobs aren't too scary. The idea being that if a tank didn't pick up a mob in the current state of things in Worlds of Draenor, those mobs had to hit so hard because tanks could mitigate so much damage that they would insta-kill a DPS, and that wasn't fun, apparently. TBC Heroics kind of say hi on that matter, but needless to say, that was the idea. The problem in Blizzard's eyes is that tanks who were using their active mitigation properly were in fact mitigating way too much damage. The only way Blizzard could compensate for that was to make things much burstier and increase the damage of everything in response to the fact that tanks were doing so much mitigation. This then filtered down into various problems down the line. What if you were using your active mitigation incorrectly? So stunted guilds that were using weaker tanks, or less good tanks, let's say, were actually running into huge problems. Those guys were having to compete against the fact that these bosses were now hitting super hard because of the good tanks and not being able to cope with it and being crushed into the floor, really halting progress further down the line. So they squashed active mitigation. I love active mitigation as an idea. Over my years of tanking, which is about 8 or 9 years, it has been one of the better changes I've seen. The game poses questions to you and you have the answers ready, and if you make a mistake, you take way more damage than you should. I actually really like the idea. So in Legion, they have squashed active mitigation for near enough every single tank. This is an overall sweeping change that affects everybody. How does this in turn feel? Did they hit their goals? Does active mitigation feel more rewarding? No, it does not. What we have actually happening in Legion is that your active mitigation tends to get chewed up and spat out pretty goddamn quickly when the situations become a little bit more than your basic day-to-day damage. This means that no matter what you press in a lot of occasions, you're going to get crushed into the floor. Many tanks have actually turned to this to be a tuning problem with their classes, but I can report after many days of tanking everything the game has been able to throw at me besides the raid testing, that this is really not the case. This is all the way through the game, and it affects every single tank for the most part. What you have is situations where either the mobs just don't do enough damage, so your active mitigation doesn't matter in the first place because you can't possibly die, or you start taking so much damage and you start using your active mitigation properly, making the correct decisions, answering the questions correctly, and you still get hammered into the ground, and there's nothing you can do about it. Far too often in Legion, I found myself quite simply with no more answers to give. Everything is on cooldown, everything has been used, and they were talking generally about trash mobs even in normal mode dungeons. To put this into some kind of context then, Violet Hold, one of the easier dungeons in Legion, as basically you deal with a very easy trash pack wave after wave. I have been in several groups now as a tank that has been unable in normal mode at Violet Hold to pass the first portal. I'm not exaggerating, that has happened to me 3 or 4 times now, where the healer, if you do get a weak healer in these dungeons, you simply just cannot cope. You end up with everything being used and you sit there just going, well, fuck, I'm screwed now. This even includes on a DK with decent self-healing. This was a really, really sad, eye-opening experience. As much as it's a nice idea that healers should have to definitely focus more on the tanks, and I do agree that tanks should go with some synergy with a healer. That makes total sense. I don't think that plays out very well when you start looking at things that are supposed to be a satisfying single-player experience. By that I mean challenge modes and raids are supposed to be in a group of people that have been somewhat vetted. They're supposed to be reasonably aware of what they're doing. You have the chance to pick and choose people there and bring along people who you think will do well. When it comes to anything you can queue for randomly as a solo player, that is not designed to be a satisfying group experience because you have no idea who the hell you're going to get grouped with, and they want a high success rate in there. We have seen historically that any dungeon that came out with a very low success rate was nerfed and tweaked because people need to be able to queue for that content solo because that's how the system's designed and have a decent success rate doing it. Otherwise, they're not going to do it because it's supposed to be that way. With this new system, I found that people, especially in Legion's Alpha, where there are a lot of people rolling random classes and specs that they don't know how to play or frankly might not be that good of a player, have absolutely been unable to adjust to the system, and as a tank you feel completely helpless in a lot of scenarios where previously you didn't. I find this to be a big problem, a big problem. Right now, if this system was to go live today and Legion came out tomorrow, I would absolutely not want to tank normal dungeons for randoms anymore. I would actually be very afraid of doing that because it's likely to be a very expensive experience should I get a weak healer or even just weak DPS so the fights go on a little bit longer than necessary. It's quite nice that, or I believe is a very rewarding experience, is when the game does pose questions and I give the correct answer, then I'm going to be pretty safe. What I find right now is the correct answer is pretty much meaningless. This change, or the overall changes, just hurts good tanks. And I think that's a very poor way to go about things. All I've felt so far, and I've been honest, and a lot of this is feeling about after playing the tanks for the last few days, is that I just feel that I'm a crap DPSer who dies first. That's it. That's the reward, and that is what has come out of these changes so far for me. I am just a crap DPSer. I have these utilities at my disposal, but they honestly don't matter too much, because if you are supposed to take a lot of damage, you're going to take a lot of damage because your active mitigation isn't going to do anywhere near enough to try and mitigate that, and then if your healers are slightly weaker, or the DPS takes some extra damage and they need some focusing, then you're probably going to die regardless of how good you are or how well you're playing your class. That is never a rewarding experience for me. It also seems really short-sighted. As I said, this only hurts the good tanks. That means that what you'll find is that the skill ceiling or the chance to progress as a tank is severely reduced in terms of your personal gameplay. It's very unrewarding is what I would say. You can't really push yourself and come back and say, okay, I can tackle this in a different manner. I like the fact that tanking, and why I enjoyed it as the most intriguing role in all of World of Warcraft for such a long time, is that I get to pre-plan a fight out to figure out the best way of dealing with it. If you look at my Mythic Hellfire Assault video, it was obviously not a difficult encounter, but it was a great way of showing how a tank can actually pre-plan an encounter and come up with a solution, a strategy to how to deal with this fight to make things as smooth as possible. Right now on a tank, given this active mitigation squash, your utter reliance are completely on other people. Even in moments of severe danger where you can't really get yourself out of jail, I found myself just thinking, well, I don't have to make these decisions. It makes very little difference to me whatsoever, unless my active mitigation is so powerful that I need it up 100% of the time, which is something that the Brewmasters have run into recently. Overall, these changes are not fun for me. What I find is that this really supports weaker tanks because they can basically spam buttons incorrectly and still come out with a very similar result from what I've felt to a decent tank as well. It doesn't seem to matter that much. In fact, the good evidence of that is the Prot Paladin we're going to look at shortly, where near enough every defensive button they press does exactly the same thing, so making mistakes doesn't really matter. That's how it's come about. That's how it feels. It feels very unrewarding. It doesn't feel like it takes much effort. On the back of this, I know that regularly when tank changes like this occur, or things get made easier, is people come along and say, well, this is actually okay for me, it allows me to focus more on other things as a tank, like the environment. I think that is a real disservice to yourself as a player. I say that because every healer and every DPS has to put out their true potential on a regular basis, while also taking into account their environment. You are not having a particularly different experience to anyone else. The difference is you might have some tank stuff to worry about, which is like tank swaps or picking up ads, but but at the same time, you're also able to survive things that ordinary other players like DPSs and healers absolutely could not survive. You get a lot of forgiveness in AoE raid mechanics, generally speaking, and a lot of other things that you should be wary of you can actually ignore while dealing with other things. It swings and roundabouts. There's all kinds of things you pick up that other people don't worry about, but at the same time, they have things to worry about that you don't. I am not a fan of tanking in Legion. I can tell you quite open-heartedly that tanking overall has not been a fun experience. I've not enjoyed the last few days of doing this. I wish it was absolutely not this way. I was looking forward to tanking in Legion pretty much a lot. I was in Berlin recently where we met up with not only fans but members of my guild, and the question was, you're definitely going to be tanking in Legion, right? To which my answer was yes. However, after coming back and doing some more in-depth research and playing it out, I cannot see that happening if this system remains. I simply just do not feel like a tank. I feel like I have aggro. I feel like I'm doing very poor DPS. My decisions don't matter too much, and that has been a really dissatisfying experience. However, a lot of that varies between the classes, so let's get into the classes and break them down how I feel they're playing gameplay-wise now. So before we get into the list, there's one spec that will not make it into the list, and that is the Brewmaster. I had prepared a whole thing for the Brewmaster. I played it many, many times to make sure I came to a conclusion that I was happy with. But as I was doing that, such is the nature of the ever-developing alpha, there was quite a large number of feedback threads and posts and actual conversation going on with the developers as to how the Brewmaster should be played. Yeah, this is kind of a precedent they've set here where they were trying to educate the players and basically saying that they were playing it incorrectly. Now, don't get all defensive over that. They have definitely redesigned the Brewmaster. It feels very, very different to the Warlords of Draenor Brewmaster. I would have said and would agreed with the many that it didn't feel anywhere near as good. And sometimes it was staggering how quickly the health bar could jump around. You were either doing easy content and a rich man, poor man situation. But the devs came back and said, look, this is how we intend you to actually play this, which involved many weird things like floating around low health to generate more orbs to get more healing, and at that point you're pretty much invincible, which then led to the obvious question is, are you asking healers not to heal a Brewmaster to full? Because that actually negates our mitigation capabilities. And then it came into all sorts of weirdness. Now, on the back of that, they've actually released, or less known as posted, a number of changes, including the return of Expel Harm and so on and so forth, to the Brewmaster. Now, as I know 100% that these changes are coming and I can't possibly test them right now, it's unfortunate that I don't want to put it in the list because I honestly don't know what these changes will do to it, and I would hate to like just stick it into the list and say, well, I rate it as this, although it's going to change very, very soon, so bear that in mind. It seems like an arbitrary exercise. So that's my point on the Brewmaster right now. So the bottom of the pile, and the one I've absolutely despised the most, I honestly felt it was a bit of a crime against my keyboard to even play this goddamn thing, is the Protection Paladin. Again, I really wish it wasn't the case. I wish I could sit here and tell you wonderful things that everything is sparkly and great. Unfortunately, it's not. If I was a new player to World of Warcraft and my friend had invited me to play and I landed on a prop paladin and I got to my boost and I did all the usual things that you get up to get a quickly capped character and then started playing this, and someone was to tell me that this is after over a decade of development and growth, I would probably tell them that Blizzard should stop playing video games. If this wasn't World of Warcraft and somebody had made a new MMO and this is one of their tank classes, I would just laugh it in their face. I have no idea how this has got to the state it is in. So let me be clear, I'm trying to be super brief here. We'll do the more detailed discussions in the longer videos. So the Prop Paladin has had Holy Power removed. In its place, they have put nothing at all. It seems that the decision was made that, oh, well, Holy Power is not a big deal to generate towards the end of Warlords of Draenor. Yeah, but we can't really, or shouldn't be, in my opinion, making decisions on classes and how they're playing in a world where some of the bosses in the most difficult raid tier are dying in seconds as opposed to even minutes. That seems like a really bad idea. Holy Power in general, I think, is actually a good idea. In Highmaul and Blackrock Foundry, it was actually something that you cared about. You had a little bit of banking to be done. You had to think about whether you wanted to use 2 back-to-back Shield of the Righteousness, prepare for that, or whether you wanted to get one out of the way quickly. This was nice, and it had nice pros and drawbacks and things you could consider. The lack of any substitution for gameplay outside of Holy Power means that a lot of spells that previously did something involving Holy Power or not have simply been reduced to doing flat damage and nothing else. Almost 50% of your rotation doesn't fucking matter if you press it or not. You're putting out damage that is trivial in comparison to anything else, and you're literally pressing it because you have nothing else to do, because that is just how the Paladin plays now. Consecration, Judgment, and Hammer of the Righteous have zero effect on anything that is involving actually tanking. In between that, we basically basically have Avenger Shield, and that's it. We have active mitigation. It's really quite sad, just pressing these buttons for the sake of pressing them. All the active mitigation tools I mentioned in the first half of the video are actually pretty much the same goddamn thing, and this is really quite sad. If I look at my buttons now, I have Guardian the Ancient Kings, 5-minute cooldown with a 50% damage reduction. My Shield of the Righteous with an 11-second cooldown actually does 55% damage reduction. This is all damage reduction. There's no interest, there's no thought process, there's nothing going on here whatsoever. The Eye of Tyr, your artifact abilities, again, flat damage reduction by 25% to AoE amount of mobs. We also have Ardent Defender, which still prevents death if you use it properly or you get a little bit lucky, but still it's a 20% damage reduction. You can see what I'm saying here. Every button feels pretty much the goddamn same with just different varying levels of effectiveness, although in general some of them are pretty much the goddamn same completely or within a couple of percent of each other. It's really quite sad what's happened here. There are some highlights that actually make this spec kind of fun or potentially fun if they do some tweaking to it. Knight Templar at the level 100 talent, where you Divine Steed, which is allowing you to mount in combat, can be used into a defensive, although that defensive is once again just damage reduction by 20%. It's still quite cool to mount up and almost joust with your enemy. That's quite good. Aegis of Light is a very, very fantastic graphical addition and cooldown. Really enjoy that ability. But other than that, it's just so poor and weak across the board. To put this into context, this is one of the most powerful tanks in Legion right now. Not surprising considering all their defensives just flat out block or prevent damage. I shouldn't use the word block here. But flat out reduce the damage you take from all sources. But the gameplay is making it so bad that so many people are just abandoning it anyway. So I've lost my voice today, obviously, due partially to being ill. This is really quite sad. The only alternative to pressing Shield of the Righteous is our Light of the Protector, which heals you in a rather mundane way for 25% of your missing health. This is neither fun nor interesting. Everything about this spec, besides these couple of interesting talents, is just crucially boring. Specking against Consecrated Hammer or Blessed Hammer, or even going as far as to use Consecrate to heal people or Judgment of Light, just isn't that interesting, unfortunately. It's just doing things for other people. It has absolutely zero effect on gameplay, and overall, it makes no goddamn sense. Most of your things you'll do as a protection paladin are just waiting for a Avenger's Shield proc should you spec into it with Crusader's Judgment, which gives you the only interaction between your tanking abilities, which is a 20% buff to Shield of the Righteous or Light of the Protector. That is the only thing you really care about. Everything else is pretty much fluff that is added on top just to make you sure that you have buttons to press. Just the big shame is that most of those buttons are utterly inconsequential. And so with great sadness, it brings me to the next one. I say great sadness, this is my main spec, but I can barely stand to play this thing now, which is really sad. The Protection Warrior. What has changed with it then? Well, in an effort to maybe simplify, and I don't really want to encourage those memes to occur, they have taken some of the decision-making process that wasn't actually that difficult to begin with out of it, particularly the choice between whether you're going to use Shield Block or Shield Barrier. Both in Warlords of Draenor cost exactly the same, and you have to decide where you're going to spend that rage in order to mitigate whatever's about to happen to you. Make the wrong decision, you're going to take a shitload more damage, generally speaking. They both work in different ways, one absorbing a flat amount of damage, the other lasting a permanent amount of time that can't be consumed. And now they've switched it back to an almost TBC model where Shield Block costs 10 rage, which really sort of disintegrates any of the weight and choice making that went on with it. 10 rage is not difficult to get. That's one shield slam will provide you more than enough rage to fire off a shield block. And they've shifted the rest of your rage spender over to Ignore Pain. Instead, getting rid of Shield Barrier and replacing this with has a rather more convoluted tooltip where you will fight through the pain. Class Fantasy has overwhelmed this spec, ignoring 90% of the next X amount of damage you take from any source. I don't particularly enjoy Shield Barrier, it's kind of a fantasy idea, but why was Ignore Pain not just made basically Shield Barrier and changed the name to Ignore Pain? It would have fit the Class Fantasy and been a little bit more sensical than this one. Now, the reason for this, I truly believe, is that they are returning to a Wrath of the Lich King style formula and everything that precursed that, in that they're going to tie your rage generation to the damage you take. Yes, I know, a lot of prot warriors who played the old school probably just lost their fucking minds. Why are the sons paying for the sins of the fathers? I don't know. This is a horrible, 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 horrible system. You can still generate some rage through Shield Slam and Revenge and such like, but unfortunately a lot of the rage that you use to keep a regular flow of gameplay, as a lot of the stuff you do involves rage, it is your only resource after all, is going to be linked to how much damage you take. Not only that, it's linked to your max HP. You heard me right. So currently in the alpha, if you dodge, parry, or even mitigate damage, yes, that includes things like shield wall, etc., etc., you will generate less rage for doing so, which means you have less resources to spend on your defensive cooldowns, shield block, and ignore pain. Not only that, increasing your HP with things like last stand, or even taking talents like Indomitable, which increase your maximum HP, will also net result you in less rage to be less defensive and use less mitigation overall in terms of gameplay. This is just absolutely horrific. When I first started playing the Prot Warrior on the alpha, I was confused as to why it felt so horrible compared to my main Prot Warrior on live. I put it down to gear, and maybe I've just got a lot of stats which kind of boosts up my gameplay and makes it a little bit more fluid and fun. But after testing it a lot recently, it just comes down to this system. Although Blizzard is claiming that the linearity of the gear scaling will counteract the fact that you're going to have a lot more avoidance and a lot more mitigation going on, the actual stats on the gear should make up for that in terms of rage generation. What I can tell you is that this system feels horrible. It feels awkward, it feels clumsy, and you go into a consistent cycle of being rich man, poor man. You either have tons and tons of rage where you're spamming your ignore pain pretty much constantly, and as we discussed in the very intro of this video, that actually doesn't mean a whole lot in a lot of circumstances if you're in a position where you're getting hit into the ground. Or you're just avoiding or mitigating a lot of damage, and therefore you don't have any resources to do anything. You're just kind of doing this rather mundane, weak source DPS rotation over and over and over and over again. The talent system revision is much worse than it is in Warlords of Draenor. From my point of view, I really like the Warlords of Draenor talent system. It had lots of choices in terms of boosting my DPS in short windows or top windows. It wasn't all based around defensives, which actually worked out really well when dealing with different encounters. Constantly swapping between various different abilities to make use of my warrior abilities, as I am a warrior at the end of the day. The loss of Blade Storm, etc. is just nothing to be happy about, in my opinion, and Bloodbath similarly. On top of that, the artifact ability Neltharion's Fury, which is igniting our shield to churn out lots of fire, does quite a considerable amount of damage, but it is also got to be remembered that it's not just a DPS ability, although I tend to use it with the guaranteed crit of Recklessness, is that it does critical blocks. Like, everything will be critically blocked while you're doing Neltharion's Fury. Unfortunately, Neltharion's Fury is a channeled spell similar to arcane missiles and the like, which means that moving cancels it. Anything that knocks you or moves you also cancels it, which is very dangerous when you're using it in an AoE group of trash. You can prepare for stuns, etc. for a boss. You should know when they're coming. But if you have a large group of ads or trash in a dungeon, if you're speedrunning it because your gear's much higher and you go for a big Neltharion's Fury, you can be very, very easily knocked out. And this defensive cooldown, you got to remember, this is a defensive cooldown, actually goes completely to waste and just goes on cooldown for the next 45 seconds, which makes it really sad. Although the proper magical mitigation of Spell Reflection is a welcome addition. I think that's quite cool. Everything else about it just makes it a really horrific, inconsistent, and unreliable class to play for me. It feels really slow sometimes, or it feels too fast, and those are always in moments where I'm actually in danger. If I actually have enough rage to start making some choices, it usually means I'm about to die, or very close to dying anyway. All these sort of net losses from gaining these gains that actually turn into losses, similar to how the Brewmaster has been affected, is really not fun, not interesting. A new player is never really going to understand why taking Indomitable and getting 25% extra maximum health might actually be a bad thing, similar to why a lot of Brewmasters having to explain to their healers that healing them to full health will in fact be a bad thing in the current state of things, which hopefully will change. I'm not a fan of anything they've done here. This is just, once again, another spec that's been altered. It's had more convoluted formulas added to it, and I look at WoD and I say, why did you bother? And this is all that I think of with my Prot Warrior. Why did you bother? What was the point? What are we achieving with this? If active mitigation was too strong, then that could have easily been changed by the rage numbers and the actual numbers the mitigation does. Did the entire spec need reworking formula-wise with rage? No, I don't think so. I felt my rage generation in Warlords of Draenor was pretty consistent and nice. I could make choices on it. I could actually plan it time-based. I knew that between X moment and X moment, I could generate X amount of rage in order to make sure that I could counter the ability the boss did. Overall, this has just been a really disappointing experience. But it's about to get better. It's not all negative. We're about to get into some of the more fun classes. Next up, I've dropped in the Vengeance Demon Hunter, and things do start to look up a little bit from here. It's hard to be excited about the Vengeance Demon Hunter. Once we saw Havoc, which came out before the Vengeance spec, considerably before, we were interested in exactly how Vengeance would be, with Havoc being so completely over the top, anime style, lots of very flashy abilities, and it's glad to see, or I'm glad to see, that Havoc has finally had some attention paid to it, so it's actually a little bit more of a fun spec. So when Vengeance launched, I think I wasn't the only one surprised, especially how the Brewmaster was introduced previously in Mr. Pandaria, to see that the Vengeance Demon Hunter was literally a mishmash of other tanking abilities, all sort of cobbled together to form a new spec and call it a day. I think it's pretty obvious that the main creativity and focus of the Demon Hunter class in general was put into Havoc, and Vengeance seemingly an afterthought on top of that. So it's hard for me to say, yay, 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 this is very exciting, or boo, 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 this is really bad, because it's actually a combination of things that are all been pretty good. They've looked at things that other people enjoyed from other tanks and stuck them all in one. You'll see essences of the Brewmaster in here, you'll see essences of the Blood DK, you'll see essences of the Warrior in here, all these kind of things, from Heroic Leap down to Demoralizing Shout, all over to Icy Gorfin's Grasp, and of course the self-healing mechanic. My criticisms really so far is that they could just do with adding a little bit more to the baseline rotation. The Vengeance Demon Hunter for me falls into a big trap where there's not much to do outside of really long cooldown buttons. We have some cool stuff like Imprison, which is a wonderful CC, but in terms of our actual gameplay, you have Immolation Aura every 13 seconds, which is not exciting in the least. It's an Immolation Aura that has a reasonably okay Fellfire graphic to it, that's about it, but all it really does is burn enemies around you and generate some pain, which is the most ridiculous resource name ever. But on top of that, you're waiting for things like Sigil of Flame every 30 seconds. What does that do? It's the same thing as Immolation Aura, it just AoE fire burns everything in an AoE. And then neither of these two buttons are exciting in the first place, let alone when put together. That's a bit of a big fucking bummer in my eyes. On top of that, you're waiting for things like Soul Carver. Soul Carver is actually a cool ability, the 1 minute cooldown, which will give you quite a nice amount of healing. I would say, though, I think most of the Vengeance Demon Hunters I've spoken to agree with me here, is that the actual effect of the healing takes a little bit too long for something that feels like it should be an emergency button. The animation is very quick, but the actual healing effect on you seems to take far too long. The rip-off of Anti-Magic Shell, which is Empower Wards, is fine. I mean, it does what it does. Magical damage taken reduced by 30%. Okay, the active mitigation in the form of Demon Spikes is a nice counter to that, which is Parry Chance, which is something you can not really rely on, but it does reduce physical damage taken by 29% and continues to scale after that, so that's always quite nice. And the recent nerfs are justified, as you can pretty much keep Demon Spikes up 100% of the time. In regards to this, outside of those buttons, really, all you have is Shear and Soul Cleave. Now, this class is global cooldown locked from the get-go, because Shear costs absolutely nothing and generates pain, which is going to be the source of your active mitigation. Anytime you're not pressing Shear or using another ability is just a lack of resources coming through for you, which is a little bit on the rubbish side, as there's not much choice there, because the only two base buttons you get, really, for gameplay are Shear and Soul Cleave. A way of thinking about this, really, would be Shear or Devastate, and basically a Death Strike style mechanic, as it does heal you up. It consumes the soul fragments is how they've worded it, but it's just a heal, essentially. But what would make this way more fun is actually buried in the talents. Fellblade is a wonderful, wonderful talent that you get 102. It's a 13-second cooldown, so it kind of falls into that niche of Rising Sun Kick and so on and so forth. Or even as a similar ability as something like Keg Smash, which is a far more efficient spell to use on cooldown, where you charge your target, you deal a decent amount of damage, and Shear, the button that you're constantly pressing, has a chance to reset the cooldown of Fellblade, making it way more interesting. My only real gameplay problem with this is that I feel like I'm pressing Shear a hell of a lot, outside of just waiting to burn things, which is not exactly an exciting conclusion to reach. And if they introduce Fellblade baseline, which I think they should do, that would be a hell of a lot more fun. All they have to do is tweak the numbers, but give us a little bit more gameplay actually going on, something to pay attention to rather than just watching the clock tick down. I did compare it to Devastate, but that's not really true. Devastate is something on average, according to the maths, you press reasonably enough about every 6 or 7 seconds. Shear, you're pressing, it feels like I'm pressing it absolutely constantly, because I'm building up pain. My Immolation Aura is Fire and Forget. My Sigil of Flame is pretty much Fire and Forget. And basically I'm just checking, do I need to get healed yet? No, keep pressing Shear. Do I need to heal now? Okay, press Soul Cleave, then go back to pressing Shear. And that's about it. The talent system is a little awkward. I've had to re-roll this a few times. because of I originally only had one Legion account from Blizzard. I did get another one for some fucking reason on my same account. So I do have a permanent Vengeance Demon Hunter now, but I have had to re-roll it a few times. So I don't really have the time to grind this thing up to 110. So I'll be waiting until 110 pre-mades before making any final conclusions. Right now I could say it's okay. It could be much better, and the answers for me seem to lie within the talent system itself. I would really, really also like to see Meta have some offensive capabilities as well. Meta is such a monstrously good animation, and it just feels so wasted that for the tanks, it generates some pain similar to an Immolation Aura and increases your maximum health by 30. You can, of course, talent it, etc. to do a little bit more, but the demon form of the Demon Hunter is absolutely immense, and there should be, I believe, at least some real tangible difference offensively while you use this. That would give this long cooldown, this 3-minute cooldown, some offensive and defensive potential, which I think could be really nice in certain scenarios to back things up, instead of just basically most people take it so they can heal themselves to full, which is fine for the most part, but it's such a cool, it's almost too good an animation to be wasted on such boring results. Right, let's cheer up a bit. The Blood DK. I've put it in here. It would certainly be my number 2 anyway, even if Monks, maybe, debate. The Blood DK. I really enjoy my time with the Blood DK. I initially was skeptical of the design that it is kind of the 2-button spec, as many called it, because the 2 real hard hitters are Marrow Rend and Deathstrike. That's the real things you want to maintain throughout the fight. And the initial incarnation was really just tagging on spells that didn't really have any purpose. It didn't matter if you pressed them or not to maintain your gameplay, just to sort of fill the time in between when you would need a global cooldown. They've had some revision recently. They called it an overhaul. Not really. It wasn't anything huge. Honestly, it seemed a little funny. They were like, well, we've revised many things. It was like, you didn't really. You didn't really. But they did enough for me to be like, I'm okay with this. I am really okay with this. If this went live this way, I'm pretty much fine with it. Is it better than Warlords of Draenor? That's going to be debatable, and I think that's a good point to be at. Whereas with the other ones that we've already looked at, obviously besides the Vengeance Demon Hunter, if someone was to say, is the Prot Paladin or the Prot Warrior better than it is in Warlords of Draenor, I would go, no, not even close. But the Blood DK seems pretty good. So what I particularly enjoy is the talent system. At the base of it, as we did say, it's kind of the 2-button system, using Marrow Rend and Deathstrike, and then you can fill with things depending on whether you want more runic power, which again is a choice you make. And then you start to flesh it out with the talent, so the talent system really does enhance that. Do you want lower cooldowns on Vampiric Blood, for example? Do you want to do that? Do you want to be able to rune tap? Do you want to exsanguinate and drain things through if you're single targeting? Or do you want Bloodworms? What is your health situation going to be like during the fight? Do you want Heartbreaker if you're going to be doing a lot of cleave? Do you want to mix and mash these things? Do you want Mark of Blood as a nice solid single target boost, similar with Blood Mirror? And we can look at Blood Mirror and maybe compare it to the Prot Paladin Knights Templar, where they're just getting a flat 20% damage reduction, as Blood Mirror also gives 20% damage reduction, but it's also going to redirect some of the damage to the target, and that's really nice. Instead of being a 20% damage reduction flat off like we've seen with the Prot Paladin, while active, 20% of any damage dealt to you is redirected to the target, so you can plan how you want to use Blood Mirror. Instead of it just being this straight up mundane damage reduction ability, it actually redirects, and you can start that makes it so much more interesting to use. I could go on and on, honestly. A lot of the talent setups in here are actually quite cool. I think they've done a pretty fucking solid job with the Blood DK. I feel happy to play it. If I was going to tank in Legion, it would certainly be up there, which is why it's near the top of the list. And it's hard to really argue with it. The artifact ability consumption, I think, is where they've let themselves down. Something much more interesting could come out of here, and I think Bone Storm could go. And I know a lot of people are like, what? Fuck you! But honestly, Bone Storm is just not that necessary for a Blood DK. It doesn't seem to fit a niche that I particularly enjoy. I used it for the first couple of times and was like, okay, it's Bone Storm, ha ha ha. The S that ties into Lord Morrigar shouting Bone Storm isn't that funny. When it came down to gameplay, it's like, you know what, I don't really need this. I get how it works. It drains your runic power. It's going to heal you up in AoE scenarios. There might be a fight I need that, in which case, sure, I'll take it. But is it fun or interesting? Not after the first time or so, no. The new animation they've given it is actually really, really nice. I'm very appreciative of that. I think they did a good job because we were stuck with, obviously, that horrible animation for so long. It's cool. It's fine. The revisions that brought back things like Asphyxiate, or Strangulate as it used to be, but it's now been baked into Asphyxiate, so it's just the stun, was really nice to see. I still absolutely wish with all my fucking heart and soul that we had Army of the Dead. I am just so lost for words as to why Army of the Dead was taken away. Even if it did fucking no damage, I just love the theme of it. I would love to just see it back, even if it wasn't a DPS increase. It's just something I can pull at the beginning of a fight that makes me feel like a Death Knight, and always has made me feel like a Death Knight. I absolutely think it is criminal. The Gorfine's Grasp is on a 3-minute cooldown, and you can talent it for 2 minutes, because I just find myself ignoring it now and just playing without it. In the first few outings as a Blood DK, I noticed I was pressing my Gorfine's Grasp, not because I needed it, but because I'm a Blood DK, and that's the kind of thing I do to make AoE better for everybody, and it's a little bit of fun, and it's a sign that you're rolling with a DK. Once I realized that I was pressing the button as my muscle memory was telling me I should have Gorfine's Grasp back by now, considering when I last pressed it, and oh shit, no, it's still got like 2 minutes to go, I ended up just not using it at all. The spell fell into absolute obscurity at that point, and I will probably be really reluctant to take Tightening Grasp, the talent that reduces it to 2 minutes, because it's just not that interesting anymore. It wasn't overpowered to begin with. If you create fights like Operator Thogar that absolutely rely on Gorfine's Grasp, that's a fault of the designers and not a fault of the class. But this signature ability was convenient. It was kind of cool. It was a nice way to deal with casters. Not that DKs already don't have ways of dealing with casters. And quite frankly, every other tank in the game plays without something like Gorfine's Grasp, besides the Vengeance Demon Hunter, which is coming in Legion, obviously. And it's not a big deal. It's one of those things that I just think was really silly to make such a big cooldown when it has become part of the classic niche flavor of the Blood DK, as has Army of the Dead. So those are my only complaints there. And there's probably no surprise then in at number 1 is... And how hilarious is this list, by the way? I just want to point out that if I was to do this list in Warlords of Draenor, the absolute worst spec I would consider tanking on would be the Guardian Druid, and my favourite would be the Prot Warrior. As we head into the current state of the Legion Alpha, and hopefully into Beta shortly, I can tell you that you've seen that Prot Warrior is rated at number second to last, considering the obvious problem with the Brewmaster. And at number 1 is the Guardian Druid. I created a video during Warlords of Draenor where I went on basically an outrageous rant against the Guardian Druid for just how poorly and antiquated this design was. And the coming into Legion, they seem to have gone, yeah, alright, let's do something with it. And what they've done has actually been really fucking cool. And I am more than happy to play this on any occasion in Legion. If I'm going to have an unhappy experience with the current changes to mitigation in Legion, the solution to that is to pick up a spec that's actually quite fun to play, and that would be the Guardian Druid. What have they done to change it then? Simple things like baking Lacerate and Thrash together, finally, and giving us an array of cooldowns that all work differently, and you have to pick and choose as to how you want to play them. Do you want Mark of Ursol? Do you want Barkskin? Do you want Survival Instincts? But it's going to be 4-minute recharge on that. Do you want to use your Rage of the Sleeper, which combines the idea that I talked about with the Vengeance DK with a tremendous animation with an interesting effect, preventing 33% of all damage you take and reflecting some damage back to the target while all the time looking cool. Very nice way of showing that defensives do not have to be fundamentally straight up defense on the paper. They can do something fun. The movement of Pulverize to be a tier 1 talent is fucking really good idea. Pulverize with the new Thrash mechanic is so easy to use and maintain that it's not boring, it's not like mandatory or anything like that. Really, really enjoy it. It's got some wonderful cooldowns and lovely talents all the way down through it. It has some problems. I'm not convinced that the affinities work out very well, although it is nice. It is really nice that if you're off-tanking, you can turn into a Moonkin and actually put out some decent damage. I'm not going to complain at anything here. I'm not. This thing is really quite cool. The Thrash cooldown seems a little extreme at 5.7 seconds, but you always have Swipe to back that up, which isn't going to cost anything. I've just had a lot of fun with this. It has some bugs and stuff that are working, and Frenzied Rejuve sure could be a little better, but there's such minor issues to how this thing plays out. It's smooth, it's consistent, there's good choices to be made, we have good abilities, we still have Stampeding Roar despite it being a 2-minute cooldown, but you also have Incapacitating Roar for an AoE silence, which is fantastic. The only thing I'm not utterly sold on with the bear at the moment is Moonfire being part of the rotation. I'm not sold on it. I feel like even in a class fantasy perspective, if I focus on the ways of the bear, that druid who focuses down that path should probably give up on being able to Moonfire things, because that doesn't make sense. I would love this to return to Fairy Fire and have something along those lines working with it, but it is what it is. If that's my biggest complaint, is that we have Moonfire, and I'm still using it to ranged pull like I would do with Fairy Fire, then that's about it. It's pretty fucking good. It's pretty fucking good. It's just a shame it currently exists in a world where tanking just overall doesn't feel that great. But it feels okay. It feels pretty decent as a Guardian Druid. And that's a nice way to end, I think. So there's my list, guys. That's where I'm up to. Leave your comments down below if you disagree with anything I've said. Please tell me you played it before you go ahead and disagree with it. That would be nice. Or if you have any counterpoints to the way I'm feeling right now. And how you guys generally feel about tanking changes overall. And their effect on more so the early game. And the easier portion of the game, which for me has turned me away. Which I don't think Blizzard really wants. As I said, I really would be reluctant in Legion to tank for random people now. Given the state of the tanking model. Alright guys. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you again. Bye bye.